Well, it's good to see you all this morning. I know it's freezing outside. It's one of the colder days this winter. And I know parking's never an issue down here at campus. So didn't have any trouble getting in here. I don't want to take up a lot of time with introduction, but just to give you kind of a little bit of background. When I first got into human services, it was an MSW back in the early 90s. I knew I wanted to work with forensic populations and people who had been on the wrong side of the law. Had no aspiration at all to work with sex offenders. I had a lot of focus on substance abuse and its relation to crime and people trying to get their lives together. But fast forward a little bit to 95, I got a job with the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections in a maximum security facility. That's where I'm from, the Pittsburgh area. And my supervisor, who had hired me and actually became a friend of mine, we were starting a sex offender program, and she wanted a male co-facilitator, which is often the norm when you're doing sex offender groups. It's good to have both a male and female co-facilitating. And I said, this is not really something that I want to do, and I really don't have a lot of time to do it, but as a favor, I'll do it temporarily until you get somebody else. And ever since then, I've worked pretty exclusively with sex offenders. I started to develop an interest. I started to be really intrigued with just the whole idea of behavior choices, especially when we're talking about things like sexual behavior, which is actually a very natural and healthy expression of oneself, and how things can kind of go awry. I'm sure you would understand this, there's no way in 2.5 hours today that we're going to be able to cover every nuance of sexual offending. But what I wanted to do was to present with you a good foundation from various domains related to sex offender behavior that I think will be of value to you to kind of spark learning and discussion of what you can make a decision for yourself, how much further you want to go with it. And so the three areas, I think anytime we're talking about conditions and changing situations, it's important to look at from at least a mental health standpoint is etiology, treatment, and interventions, strategies and interventions. And with that, I'm talking mostly about assessment and then actually doing some treatment with the situation. And so that's the foundation that I'm going to use today. All right. There we go. The agenda, and it's a pretty ambitious agenda, but I do think that we should be able to get through it for the most part, is we're going to talk from an etiological perspective, and this is as much my experience and my understanding of what works best, to look at it from sexual development, of course, attachment issues and criminal personality. Attachment, and anybody who's had any of my classes here knows that I talk a lot about attachment and social learning as ways of people kind of formulating self-opinions, but also how they interact with other people. So we'll look at the etiology of offending from those three lenses. Then for treatment targets, I'm just going to talk to you about what the current research and recent research has said about what we should be looking at with sex offenders and what has worked as far as trying to intervene in those areas. It's an ongoing treatment research area, but there is a lot more that we know today than we knew, even back when I started working with sex offenders. And then intervention strategies, we're going to talk specifically, I always like when I do anything like this, to give you perhaps some take-home tools or ideas that you can use in practice. And actually, the majority of that you could use with any kind of resistant criminal population. I tailor a lot of it towards sex offenders because of the study, but it doesn't mean that these are only things that only work with sex offenders. So you can make your judgment about that, but I think you'll find it translates over pretty well. The objectives, hopefully as you're leaving today, you'll feel you've got an enhanced understanding of how sexual offending occurs, a basic knowledge of what a sex offender assessment should look like, look at some of the more effective treatment directions, and do some practice with some case conceptualization and treatment strategies. I hope Audrey, when she was giving out the handouts, that included in it a printout of a case called James. Do you have that? Okay. Because that's going to be one of the exercises that we do. So you don't have to worry about that right now, but we'll actually get to that. All right. I always like to assess, and it's not, I mean, it can affect some of how I go with the training and how much time I spend on certain topics. To just get a general idea of the audience, I know that we have some students here from the MSW program, but there's a lot of folks I'm not as familiar with. How many of you here, and this includes students as well, have currently are working with sexual offenders, or in your role at times come across having to do work with sexual offenders? Raise your hand. Okay, so there's a good piece of you for that. How many of you work inside institutions in which that service is provided? Raise your hand. Okay, good. And so I assume the rest of you are in some kind of a community situation. How many of you work in it's a correctional setting, something under the Department of Corrections? And the others, I assume, is under the Department of Health Services and a mental health perspective. Okay, good. All right. That's actually a fairly large percentage of folks who actually work with sex offenders. So some of the questions you may have could relate to specific situations you're dealing with when we get to the treatment piece, and in fact, I enjoy kind of addressing those. So let's start with the three lenses we're going to look at etiology with. And probably the best way to start, I mean, any one of these topic areas we could do a week-long seminar on, but when we're talking about some key things to think about, one of the things we want to look at is how people learn about what is appropriate sexually, as far as sexual behavior. What is the healthy way, or the way they kind of learn how to meet this need? Because being sexual isn't something we have an option on. That's just part of who we are. How we express it and how we grow in that area is something that can be modified based on our environment and other aspects. Things that you want to think about when you're talking about young children who are engaging in sexual behavior, key take-home things you can think about is, one, it should be in line with other kinds of exploratory play and curiosity. So it's going to be with children of similar age, similar size. These are kids who could be playing in the sandbox together, playing ball together, just as easily as they are experimenting sexually. These aren't unique relationships just for the purpose of sex. It's just exploration. It's generally mixed gender, friends rather than siblings. Is as much cultural as it is anything, but we could look at areas where that becomes a problem, but other times where it's not as significant of a problem. Voluntarily, again, it's consenting. Nobody's being forced to do it. It's part of, as I said, a kind of a lighthearted, spontaneous curiosity that they're exploring with one another. There can be possible confusion and some guilt. Certainly shouldn't be shame, fear, or anxiety. I mean, as a child, you aren't born with those kinds of reservations about sexual behavior. And so if we see that, for me, at least, flags start going up that there has been some adult intervention as far as what's been going on with them. Sexual behaviors, as I said, are balanced with curiosity about other things, and it can be a broad range of things. I mean, as parents or as individuals who are working with kids, seeing some kissing and hugging usually doesn't bother you. You walk in and they're kissing each other on the genitals or touching each other on the genitals, that may cause you to freak out a little bit, but generally that is not what we would classify as bad behavior as far as exploration goes. Kids will use oral exploration and things of that nature. So again, situations could be different, but it's not something we would identify as unhealthy or unnatural. Sexually healthy families, again, the boundaries are there, and the emotional and physical privacy are there based on the development stage of the child. Of course, parents shower with their kids when they're small. If they're showering with their kids when they're teenagers, you probably want to talk to them about that kind of behavior. There's a lot of, hopefully, non-exploitive and functional ways that people are talking to each other about a variety of topics. They include information about sexuality. Their general communication is appropriate. It's not necessarily a taboo topic. It's not necessarily the focus of the topic. Again, it's whatever is developmentally appropriate, what the situation calls for. They have a respectful appreciation of bodily functions and sensate experiences that help promote body image in all of its members. They have an appreciation for erotic responses and facilitate appropriate expression rather than constantly restraining it. So, again, you're talking about cultural and family choices, and this is certainly something we want to respect. But for the most part, the message that this is something that isn't going to be discussed, or there's something dirty or wrong about your sexual thoughts or behaviors, is certainly going to lead to more problems down the road, at the very least in relationships and intimacy, and with a combination of other things that could even be worse than that. Shared overall value system which promotes effective and responsible sexual decision-making, considering the developmental maturity of each family member. And as children get older, when I talk about sexual decision-making and sexual education, I'm also talking about things like self-respect, respect of other people, the idea of consent, the idea of intimacy, the idea of respecting the whole idea of your own sexuality and other people's sexuality, not just how do babies get made, and what's ejaculation mean, and those kinds of things. When they get violated, when normal sexual behavior or development gets violated, it's the things you may see to kind of indicate that something's not quite right. Is you start to see an increase of sexual behavior out of touch with peers. So, a little something, everything in moderation, I guess, as the saying goes. The exploration of sexual behavior is absolutely normal and healthy. When it becomes like the focus of all the games that the kids are playing, or the focus of all the conversations they're having, a flag should go up. More advanced sexual behaviors, things that would not be a part of normal touching and exploration. So as I said before, kissing, hugging, even touching of genitals is something you would expect in somebody who's trying to explore. Inserting things into each other's sexual orifices. This is something that is not necessarily going to be a natural occurrence, and so we would wonder how did this become part of their repertoire? Inability to integrate experiences which are out of touch with their developmental phase. So they, again, if they're engaging in behavior because they're curious about how would this feel, or what would this smell like, and those kinds of things, that's normal. If you start to see it being more than that as a way of maybe controlling somebody, or other kinds of control tactics associated with it, we would be concerned about that. And understand, too, this doesn't always necessarily mean that the person has been sexually abused. Sexual abuse or sexual inappropriateness can take on many forms for young folks. It could be being exposed to maybe adult material, either on the TV or the computer, either intentionally or when people aren't aware that they're paying attention to those kinds of things, where they're seeing things beyond their life experiences. And this is true even with children who are quite intelligent and maybe advanced intellectually. It doesn't necessarily make them advanced emotionally and mature-wise. So being exposed to these kinds of things and being able to make sense of it, or not being uncomfortable by it, is a different story. We see the shame and the guilt and the anxiety and the loss of trust in others and self. We see a lot of compulsiveness with the overstimulation. We also see that they begin to use sexual behavior as a way to kind of bond or connect with peers, as a way of making friends. Okay? Some of the things that we may see in children who've had their sexual development violated is excessive and public masturbation. We may see the insertion of objects into theirs or other genitals, talking about sexual acts, and kind of having a real matter-of-fact, blasé perspective of sexual behavior. So these are all things that we'd be interested in exploring more where this is coming from. They can participate in a full range of adult sexual behaviors, and you start to see the conspiracies about keeping things quiet and being secretive about it. Again, people don't keep secrets unless they know what they're doing isn't good, and for that to happen, somebody has planted that seed oftentimes. They use it as manipulation and coercion to gain other children's participation. And then, of course, in the worst scenarios where children are being more exploited and abused, they actually become to expect this kind of behavior in relating with adults. Now, this is victimization. Don't mistake victimization for perpetration. Majority of people who victimize or have their sexual development violated do not go on to become sex offenders. The majority of people who are sex offenders, however, oftentimes have had aspects of their sexual development violated in some way. So these are things that are going to have a potentially negative impact on the young person in a variety of different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be just by them becoming a perpetrator. Okay. You understand what I'm saying when I say that? Again, children can cover their comfort level or their emotional vulnerability oftentimes. They can start to kind of separate from peers or have difficulty making friends. You see a lot of poor coping skills and impulse control issues in a variety of areas, and it's not necessarily that the development being violated created these lack of coping skills and impulse control issues, but they oftentimes go hand in hand, and they may start to become sexually and physically aggressive. And I said before, they're kind of focusing primarily on sexual thoughts and feelings. And probably one of the more scary things that we see is they only start to use sexual behavior in connection with other kinds of negative feelings, either as an expression of anger or as a way of coping with loneliness, fear, or frustration. And that's one of the things that can start down the pathway of the etiology of offending, because the person now may use sex as part of an unhealthy way of dealing with other circumstances that are inevitably going to happen in their life. So then we have folks who, we're kind of developing the perfect storm here, I guess. You have folks whose sexual development has been negatively impacted in some way, either by not being able to develop because of a lot of repression or having parts of that development interfered with. You combine that now with some attachment issues in the way that they relate to other people. And attachment, of course, we know starts quite early, but adolescent attachment is one of the focuses here, because this is the stage where folks begin to make connections with people outside of the family. And so what you may see there is kind of the manifestation of some of how attachment was started in the family dynamic. So they're, of course, less dependent on parents, but having support from their parents as they start to reach out to make other attachments is important. There's oftentimes anxiety associated with this. And so you can see where if persons are using sexual behavior as a way of coping with anxiety or frustration or a way of making connections in situations, this is a prime time for that to take on a sexual connotation. Anyone who's had any psych courses, child development courses, should be familiar with Bowlby and Ainsworth's attachment models. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. The first three generally are attributed to Bowlby's research, and then Ainsworth, in her attachment studies, identified this organized attachment. The first one being, the healthy, secure attachment where the individuals feel connected. to their significant others. The other three are variations of when that goes awry. For purposes of this workshop and for sex offending, an attachment model that I think oftentimes translate a little better is Bartholomew's model of attachment. He's looking at sexual offenders, and a lot of sex offender research around attachment will use Bartholomew's model. Can you guys see the graph there pretty good? Can you see the words and stuff? Okay. Just to give you an understanding of what this says, the items up top have to do with opinions of the model itself. And then in parentheses is the tendency towards dependence on others. So in this square, for secure, this is a positive model of self and a low dependence on others. And then in preoccupied, we see a negative model of self and a high dependence on others. With the model of other on would be your left side, the top is positive and the bottom is negative, and then in parentheses is tendency towards avoidance of other people or avoidance making connections with other people. So again, secure attachment has a positive view of others, positive view of self, low need for dependency, but also a low desire to avoid others. So this is what we see when we see different aspects of secure attachment. The others have their tendencies kind of in a more skewed direction. Dismissing, as Bartholomew defined it, has a negative view of others, even though they have a positive view of themselves, a low dependence on others, but a high level of avoidance of others. So this is not only not much dependence, but not much connection or desire for connection to others. And then you can interpret kind of the other two as well. So if I were to ask you, without having varying degrees of understanding of sexual offenders and sexual behavior, if you had somebody in your group who was tendency to molest children, let's say, not necessarily pedophilic, where that's their primary interest, but they have been involved in molestations of children. Which of these four quadrants, I'll give you that it's not going to be this one, which of these other three quadrants would you feel that they'd likely be in? And if you've been in one of my classes where I've showed this, don't answer the question, just you can kind of observe and relish in your knowledge there. But for the others, which of these three would you find that person most likely? Don't worry about giving the wrong answer, just explain why you picked the answer you did. Yes?
I think fearful because if they have a high avoidance of other people, then maybe sexually molesting children is more comfortable because it's someone younger and less someone they can control and they don't have that fear of child.
Okay. The response was fearful because their high avoidance of others, meaning same age peers, I assume you're meaning by that, makes them more prone then to access children, right? Actually, this quadrant, you're actually right, and your explanation is certainly in the ballpark of one of the reasons why we look at that. But if you look at it even more comprehensively, and if you think about it intuitively, if you have a negative opinion of yourself and a tendency to be highly dependent, you need some connection, but there is some resistance to connecting with folks who you see as intimidating, and part of that may be because you have such a low opinion of yourself and not such a good opinion of them. It puts you in a situation where your ability to make good adult same-age connections lower. And remember I said before, sexual drive, sexual needs is a natural thing. So if you're not in a situation where you can get that addressed in a healthy way, it does open the door for you to get it addressed in unhealthy ways. And so one of those components of child molestation falls within that category. So that's a good selection. So let's go to another type of offender, somebody who is a rapist. And this may not necessarily be a sadistic person who actually is sexually turned on by the suffering of other people, but whose offenses tend to be aggressive, forceful, and with non-consenting partners. What quadrant would you find them in, do you think?
maybe a negative view of themselves. However, they want to make connections. You know, they have a sort of positive view of others. Like they want to make connections with people. Then maybe in their minds they kind of think like the only way, you know, no one's going to want to actually consent to, you know, having some kind of contact with me. So the only way I can is to force it.
Okay. I mean, the way you're thinking about that certainly conceptualizes something that could be a problem. That probably wouldn't be the one that I would select. Though this and these two actually, you end up more with your child offenders because, again, positive view of others but negative view of self makes it real hard to make steps towards somebody who's of same age. You generally see the assaultive guys in this area. They have a very positive view of themselves, actually. In fact, almost entitled. You know, how lucky you are to be on a date with me this evening. And as far as your opinion of other people, you can imagine that hurting them is not something that's going to really factor into their decision making. In fact, we run into the problem of actually objectification, where they don't even see the person as a person. They don't have any real desire to be connected to them, yet, you know, for sexual reasons, they have to at least be with them. And so it becomes a very situational set of circumstances. And this is where we would see a lot of that kind of narcissistic individual who takes advantage of other people. Now, you can find an offender, yes?
I'm sorry, I got a little confused there. So the dismissing is the rapist?
Yes.
Okay, raping other adults.
Yes.
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you can find an offender in any of the categories, actually, at some extent, depending on the circumstances. And we haven't even talked about sexual interest at this point. But just from a personality standpoint, that's generally the way that they would load up. And that's most of the research around it. That's where they generally load up whenever you look at characteristics. So when we see secure attachment, not only do we see folks who are able to make good connections to other people, but some key pieces related to offending, at least, or I should say more related to just being able to connect to other people, is we see empathy, a likelihood to be willing to be vulnerable enough to actually put yourself in somebody else's shoes. But the other piece is, and I think we kind of overlook this, but it's very significant, the ability to maintain relationships in the face of conflict. People with the backgrounds of secure attachment don't associate the whole relationship with the one situation. So, for example, families who have secure attachment may have arguments, they may have fights, they may go a day or two without talking to each other. But in the long run, what pulls them back together is that there's love, there's safety, there's security, and so we can work past whatever the situation was. Folks who've had insecure attachment tend to get very confused about the emotion-behavior connection. So we see things like instrumental emotion, which is using emotions as a way of controlling other people. You use emotion as an instrument as opposed to as an expression of the way you feel. So this is the person who's acting angry to intimidate or to keep people at bay, even though they may not be that intensely angry. They also tend to use physical forms of expression. So they may use, or be more prone to use, sexual expression as a form of intimacy. So combining some of the other things we said about attachment and this, you can see with, especially somebody who's had their sexual development violated to some extent, kind of heading in a direction that can be problematic. And then the last lens we're going to look at deals with actual criminal personality or the development of bad decision making, especially in relation to other people. And here is, volumes of research about personality disorder and delinquency. And I'm not going to go into the extent of all of it. Two of them that are getting a lot more attention are the cognitive functioning deficit model and the emotional learning deficit models. And a big reason why they're getting so much attention behaviorally is because of the advent of the functional MRIs and the PET scans. And you may have seen some of the research that's coming even out of UW here. Joe Newman is actually on faculty in the psych department here. where they're looking at the connection of limbic or emotion-centered amygdala functioning and frontal lobe or decision-making judgment functioning. And although they at times seem like they're at odds with each other with the way they're developing the theory, though they do have a lot of similarities and overlap. The cognitive functioning deficit, we talk about as response set modulation deficit, is simply, you do what you do a lot of times based on how you interpret the environment you're in and how you've learned to recognize that environment from past experiences. So a person who has good response set modulation would not likely walk into the same problem over and over again. So you walk into a room, you're 15 minutes late, people kind of look at you like, where the hell have you been? You're disrupting us. You get that sense that this was not a good decision to make. So next time you are going someplace, you may want to be a little earlier, not because of the punishment, but because you remember what happened and how awkward it was. You understood what the response you were getting. You modulated your decision making as a result of that. Folks who have difficulty with that walk into a situation, say like that, see it as kind of a unique experience. These people are just difficult, they're unfriendly. This is not a big deal. They don't tie it to the behavior that they're doing. And so from the one point you see it, well, they're just not taking accountability and responsibility for what they've done. But from their perspective too, they're not learning ways of avoiding that in the future. So folks who have this problem not only can be disruptive to others, they often have difficult times themselves because they're frustrating to other people, right? Social or emotional learning is a concept that Blair talks about. He's a British researcher, actually in the United States now. And what he talks about is, we learn a lot from emotional information. So even as a small child, you grow up and you realize that, when you do certain things and people are smiling and they're happy and they're being nice to you, hey, this is probably something I should do more of. And if you do certain things and people are expressing frustration, they're angry, treating you a different way, you start to think, well, maybe I shouldn't be doing this as much. And it's through that emotional learning that we do develop a lot of character and interpersonal skills. If I'm talking to somebody, and as I'm talking to them, I see that they're getting emotional, they're maybe tearful, they seem upset, I recognize that. I'm going to modulate what I'm saying to them. My emotion sensors have said, you may be the result, you may be the cause of some of this. See what's going on. If you don't have that capacity, or if it's so limited, and it's not connecting to your judgment centers, you may continue to plow through that situation and not at all be impacted by it. Okay? So from a sex offender perspective, let's just say, an individual who rapes another person has to maintain arousal in the face of a partner who is not only resistant, but struggling and upset and certainly not reciprocating any of the sexual behavior that's going on. Yet they're continually able to maintain that arousal through that. One of the suggestions is that there's very limited impact on the emotion of the other people to their decision making. And Blair talks about it more specifically in what we call the violence inhibition mechanism, which is that people are naturally adversely affected by the struggling of other people. So that if you're with somebody who's upset, you tend to not feel good about that. And folks who are more likely to be violent or difficult with other people to these levels of extreme tend to not be affected that way. Okay. So again, we're talking about decision making, being able to process information in certain ways. The MRI studies are looking at are doing different tasks. What part of the brain is actually being engaged and to what extent? And we are seeing, on the extreme end of what we call the psychopathic personalities, we are seeing some deficits in these areas. So not all offenders struggle with this, but those who tend to be more habitual, more violent, more likely to be involved in multiple offenses would fall in that category. So part of kind of tying it together with some of the earlier stuff that we talked about, how does a person's brain become that way? Well, naturally, when we're talking about organic
functionings of the body, there's a possibility of hereditary impact and things of that nature. But part of it too can be the result of some of the experiences they have during their developmental stages. So in a normal neurocognitive change process of somebody growing up, as a child, they start to develop the lateral prefrontal cortex, which is a lot of problem-solving kinds of decision-making. So we see process performance feedback, update performance feedback, and anticipation of direct and future outcomes. And you think of a child and all these highfalutin things going on, you're like, not my child, that doesn't happen to them. But this is things like, little Willie, goes to get some cookies, and you see that he's getting cookies off the counter, so you put them on top of the refrigerator. So Willie can't reach them, so he's processing his performance feedback, can't get those cookies. So I got to update my performance strategy. I'm going to go get the kitchen, take one of the chairs from the kitchen, slide it over to the counter. If I can climb on that chair, I can climb on that counter, and then I can reach the cookies. And I got to do it quick because if mom comes in, there's going to be hell to pay. So I am anticipating some, I'm getting a cookie or I'm going to get in trouble kinds of things. All right, basic, simple example. Adolescent development's a little more abstract, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So this is being able to abstractly process information, and this is where we see the risk estimation and anticipating outcome involved with decision making. And what we know about, especially the frontal cortex development, that this can go, we think of adolescence as 13 to 18, but actually this could go on into the early 20s. And so sad to see, in our news where 9 people crowded into a car, crashing and people dying, and you think, how can that happen? Risk estimation and anticipating outcome is not a skill that necessarily comes naturally. And for some folks, it takes longer to develop. I have worked with people who seem to be almost irretractably antisocial. I mean, juveniles who, your concern was this person is just going to be a habitual offender and problems. And in spite of maybe working with them, they continue to get better. And they eventually, what we see is actually growing out of some of their behaviors. This is also one of the reasons why I get so concerned when we have such heavy-handed criminal justice policies with adolescents, because for some, the difference between being 18 and 25 can be extremely different. In fact, the people who developed the Hare psychopathy checklist, Robert Hare and Adele Forth, his colleague, in conversations I've had with Adele, she has said it's not a bad idea to reassess in the early 20s. You don't generally see a lot of changes in psychopathy across the lifespan, but from teen years into early 20s, it is worthwhile assessing that, because you can see people actually changing, becoming better at making decisions, and a variety of other kinds of behavior choices. But if a child experiences a lot of trauma, and it can be either chronic or acute trauma. Acute trauma, of course, we're talking about the abuse situations and experiencing those kinds of things. But it could even be things like having to go through a metal detector at your school every day. Because you see on the news that people getting shot, and people in your neighborhood being shot, and sirens being a part of your everyday. We see them getting kind of people adjusting to that, but that doesn't mean that the impacts of that chronic trauma aren't affecting them. And what we know about research is that that elevates cortisol levels, and that in and of itself, happening too frequently, can start to impact frontal limbic connections. So the limbic being the emotional piece, the frontal being the judgment piece. And when that happens, we run into the way it manifests itself in a variety of ways. Two that we speak to what we're talking about is a problem inhibiting your aggressive responses and largely being unresponsive to discipline. Okay? Any questions about what I've talked about so far? Does it make kind of intuitive sense to you? Okay. So let's do an exercise. And part of this, we're going to take about 15 minutes on this exercise. So rather than do this and take a break and kind of interrupt the time flow, why don't we do them together? So in the next 15 minutes, besides taking a minute to stretch your legs and use the restroom if you need to, what I want you to do is to read this case of James. And I want you, either together with some of the colleagues you're with or by yourself, just put marks, parentheses, around aspects of this case that you feel, we're not labeling James as a sex offender at this point, but that you feel are relevant, that you would want to address if you were working with James to deal with, potential sexual issues or delinquency issues based on some of the things that I've spoken to you about this morning. Okay, so you're going to have an exercise where you're going to assess areas that I want to address with this young person. You don't even need to necessarily come up with how you're going to address it, but I want to pursue this, I'm going to look at this, and then use the restroom or take your break, and then around 10 o'clock, I'm going to ask you for some of your feedback on what you would be addressing with James. Okay? If you have any questions,